Chapter 43 Malini. The temple was so large it was visible even from quite a distance. The sight of it struck an old memory in her. She knew this place, its golden sandstones, its ivory inlaid domes. Something about it felt familiar. She didn't know why. Beneath the light of the sunset, it would glow like burning embers, like the finest temples in the city of Harshingar itself. But those temples were by necessity awe-inspiring. They served Parijat's highborn and royalty, and reflected the grandeur of the empire and the importance of the faith. There was no reason for a temple surrounded by swaths of barren land and sparse, bedraggled copses of trees to be so ornate. As the chariot jolted forward along the dirt track, Malini raised a hand to protect her eyes from the glare of the sun and surveyed the land around them. It was not farmland as she'd first assumed, but wasteland. The soil was largely arid and strangely jagged. Rock formations roiled like waves, fossilized in the act of breaking on a shore. Holes pitted the ground. This was a battleground once, Lata murmured from her place beside her. I thought it a possibility, or the site of some terrible natural disaster, Malini agreed, looking down once more at the great gouges in the earth. She thought of Priya then, her gifts, the way she could reshape the earth, and wondered with a strange feeling in her chest if the temple elders had fought here during the Age of Flowers. You can tell from the ground alone. I am not reading the soil, my lady, although I wish I had the skill to do so, Lata said with a slightly embarrassed smile. I recognize the temple's architecture. Look between the domes. There. Lata raised a hand, pointing, and Malini followed her guidance. Between the domes of the temple stood a tower. It was no watchtower, no edifice made of particular use. It was thin as a blade, thin enough to cut only the faintest scar against the blue-white sky. Ah! Now that she had seen it, she remembered the tale. The battle that ended the Age of Flowers was preceded by a meeting of the highborn of the subcontinent's city-states. Called together, they shared their sorrows and their angers, their great fear for the Yaksa, and how their land had changed under the touch of those immortal spirits. And then the Yaksa had come. It had been a massacre. All of the most venerable kings and princes had been killed, including Divyanshi's own highborn father. The land never recovered from the deaths, but a temple was erected there, marked with a tower like a blade, or so the Book of Mothers said. Malini knew its words very, very well. Only one priest awaited them at the entrance of the temple. He was a small figure, narrow-shouldered, with large eyes, sharp bones. My name is Mitul, he slight man said, by way of greeting when Malini alighted from her chariot. His eyes were oddly pale, the almost green Malini had only ever seen in the faces of Duawali soldiers who carried blood of the Jagate and Papure tribes that harried Parijatvipa's borders. You have been eagerly awaited, Empress. And who awaits me? Malini asked. You followed a message here, Mitul replied, eyes politely lowered. I am sure the Empress knows. The words verged on insulting, but Malini allowed them to pass. But she could not hide her anger when Mitul shook his head and stood before the door, barring the way when Malini's followers approached. Her highborn, her guards, her women. Priya. All of you cannot enter, the priest said, apparently unfazed by the armed men at Malini's back. He said, This is a holy place. All temples are holy, Malini said, watching the priest with intent eyes. And all temples surely welcome the highborn of Parijatvipa. Only you, Empress, he said. I would be a great fool to enter even a holy place unprotected, Malini said evenly. True faith demands risk, Mitul replied. She stood for a moment still and silent. The men behind her were equally silent, unwilling, it seemed, to argue with a priest of the mothers. A maid, or a guard, Malini said after a moment. The priest shook his head. Faith, he repeated again. Just as Divyanshi acted with faith, so must you, Empress. Faith that demanded mindless acts with no grounding in the logic, in what would be risked and what could be gained. She hated to be asked this, just as she hated releasing the priest of Sakata when he had more than deserved a slow death. But what use would it be to turn away and not see what was being offered to her? She turned. "I will return within an hour," Malini said. Lata inclined her head. Her jaw was set, her eyes watchful. Deepa looked worried but said nothing, and Razia was frowning. Priya's eyes were strangely distant. "There are flowers in the temple," Priya said, in a voice quiet enough that Mitul will surely not hear it. There were weapons, then, within the temple. There was a comfort in that thought, even though Malini knew well enough that there was little anyone could do for her, not even Priya, if someone simply decided to slit her throat. Malini ascended the steps alone and followed the priest inside. There was another priest waiting for her. He waited in a room that had the look of every private prayer room Malini had seen in her life. Plain walls. One latticed window that allowed a fracture of light in. There were statues of the mothers, arranged on an altar, their bodies half a man's height and wrought in silver, garlands of pale flowers at their feet. The room itself was lit by warm candlelight and perfumed by incense that was strangely fresh rather than cloying. Its scent reminded her of the wind that had reached her from the ocean, sharp with salt yet faintly sweet. And the priest himself, when he turned to look at her, was just as unremarkable as his surroundings. He was of average height, with a mark of ash on his forehead and no ink limed onto his arms or hands, which were bare, his shawl draped only loosely at his shoulders in deference to the heat. His hair was tied back from his face, each braid bound with thread to keep it at bay, leaving his features exposed. His face was unlined. He was perhaps only a few years older than her. He bowed as she approached, then rose in one fluid motion from the floor cushions where he had been seated, by all appearances, meditating. "Are you the one called the Faceless Son?" Malini asked. He inclined his head. "Yes." "What is your name?" Malini asked. "Kartik," he said. "You do not remember me." "Should I?" Malini asked. "You were a girl when I met you," he replied. His voice was deep and inflected with an accent she did not quite recognize. "Sakitan, perhaps. Many, many years ago, you came with your brother to the imperial temple. You laid flowers at the feet of the mothers and whispered to them, made promises to them. I was only a boy then, training in faith, and swept the floors when you departed." She could not recall the moment he spoke of, but it seemed possible, likely even. She had gone to the imperial temple alone from time to time as a girl. For all that she'd had little room in her heart for faith, she had found the temple itself comforting. Its silence, its relative privacy, compared with the noise and bustle of the mahal, where there were always courtiers and warriors and other highborn streaming through the corridors. How long had he held this memory close, preserved perfectly in his mind's eye? Did he know what this one tale, this one brief insight into his past, revealed about him and his desires to her all in one fell swoop? "I know you," his words had said. "I remember you. You matter to me. I want to matter to you, too." "You are a royal priest, then," said Malini mildly. Had he been one of the men who had prepared her pyre and prayed over her and waited to see if she would choose to burn? The day she should have died was crystal clear in her memories, in some ways, and in blurred others. And yet, the Faceless Son? "Names have power," he said. "Your Aloran prince could tell you so. You would not have come on this bidding of Kartik, who serves the royal priests loyally. But it is not the high priest. Kartik is not your brother's closest confidant, and the power behind the throne. But for the Faceless Son, who has power in the temples that lie at the farthest reach of the empire, who holds power among the priests who did not rise under Chandra's rule, who has men who will die for him you have come." "I did indeed," Malini agreed. She let warmth touch her voice, let it draw him as light draws moths. "And I am glad to be here. You cannot know how glad. I thought the priesthood stood entirely against me. I witnessed priestly warriors turn upon me at Sakata's maze fort, priests who used the fire-born of dead women to win my brother's battles for him. And it pained me, Because I am a scion of Divyanshi, because I know the mothers set me upon this path, and the very priests of the mothers themselves, it seemed, could not see me. And then I was saved, she went on, quite quiet weight in her words, saved by a priest dressed as a soldier, who worship not as your brethren do in Parijat itself, but as Saketans do, with no less faith but with different effigies, with marks on their skin, and I placed my trust in his Saketan fellows, who saw me, it seemed, as I knew I should be seen, as a devoted worshipper of the mothers, as someone who wanted to save Parijatvipa. They asked me to obey, and I obeyed. And for my piety, I was sent here, to you. She stepped closer to him. His gaze was steady and piercing, as all priests' eyes were, but that did not mean she had failed to understand him and his wants. It can be no secret why I'm here. I want the support of the priests of the mothers when I take my throne. I cannot rule Parijatvipa without you, nor do I wish to. You would admit such vulnerability. His voice was soft, almost kind. I am a stranger to you, even if you are not one to me. No priest of the mothers is truly a stranger to me, Malini said in return. I share blood with Divyanshi, the first mother of flame. I felt her voice in me when I took up the mantle of Empress. If the priests of the mothers are the hands and the eyes of the mothers and serve their will, then we are almost kin, you and I. Generous words, he said, but you are willing to kill your kin, and kill priests also. Priests of the nameless, who died willingly, surely you will not denigrate their sacrifice by calling it murder at my hands. He inclined his head, accepting her words. I am an orphan, Divyanshi's scion, he said. She noted neatly, sidestepping the question of whether to call her empress or princess in the process. I had no one before a temple of the faceless mother claimed me, but it was the high priest who raised me to the position I now occupy, and he is perhaps the closest thing to a father I possess, and he supports your brother Chandra wholeheartedly. And yet, Malini said, here I stand. Perhaps this is a trap for you, he replied, speaking her own suspicions, to return you to your brother's care. She shook her head. I was given a gift, said Malini, a box of stone with a bloom of magical fire inside it. A good lure, he said, one small gift of a mother-blessed fire, an easy way to lull you into trust. Did you not consider that? Surely you did. I did. And you brought no guards with you, no soldiers. Such unpreparedness suggests a mind ill-suited to the throne. The fire itself was not the gift, Malini said, ignoring his taunt. She would not be lured into revealing what defenses and weapons she had easily to hand. It was its death that was your gift to me, priest. I held the flame with my own saber, felt its strength and heat, and I watched it wither and fade. That is not how the fire of the mothers died, for the fire that saved us from the Yaksa behaves. I know every line of the Book of Mothers. I know this with utter certainty. Fire of the mothers could not be quenched, she quoted. It burned as the sun burns. It burned with blessed strength. It carried it the hearts of the mothers, he continued, taking up the cadence of her words. There was, she was faintly sure, a light of approval in his eyes. I ate and ate, burned with fury, until it swallowed all the Yaksa whole and left the people of Parijatvipa unharmed, and with the Yaksa dead the mother's fire departed. You gave me the fire as a message, Malini said, as his words died into silence. You know, priest, that the fire my brother has created is not the fire of the mothers. You know he is not the worthy heir to Parijatvipa that he believes he is, that the priests of the mothers have, perhaps, long believed he is. I can only assume that you want something from me that Chandra cannot give you. His expression remained approving. He inclined his head. You are wise in your scripture, he murmured. As all Parijatvipans should be, Malini replied. She filled her voice with conviction. I want to serve Parijatvipa, I want to lead Parijatvipa as I know the mothers desire from me. You know what I want from you and your fellows, priest. I know you want to help me. I feel it. But we are creatures that live in the world, flawed though it may be, and we seek to protect our own. The Parijati priesthood has gained a great deal of power under my brother's rule. Military power, political. I understand that remaining loyal to him may be compelling. So I must ask, what do you need from me that he cannot provide? He was silent, while Lini took a step closer still. All I have done for faith. Now place your faith in me, priest. It is only fair, only just. He inclined his head in agreement. There is a war coming, the priest said. You don't speak of my war with Chandra, Malini murmured. No, not that. Though it is the priests I have trained who serve in Chandra's battles. That explained his rise in the ranks of royal priestly service then, despite his Sakitan heritage. Once the priests who stand above me, the high priest among them, believed that the fight for a better Ahiranya would be fought by its emperor against disloyal highborn, men who had forgotten their vows to the mothers. But I always knew that was not so. He said, You perhaps saw things unnatural and strange in Ahiranya, or Prince Aditya showed you visions of the nameless, or you have seen what comes in the presence of the rot. His voice had a steady cadence, even and sure. You know what I know. You know our ancient enemy comes. That is the war that lies upon the horizon. The nameless, the mothers, the faceless mother herself, they speak with the same voice. The Yaksa will return. The rot heralded them. They will come, and there will be war again. The hair on the back of her neck rose. The Yaksa. There was a terrible sense within her of things slotting into place, as what she had seen in Ahiranya and what she had seen since reworked into new shapes in her head and heart, rot flowering across the empire and Priya's great magic, rivers upended and vines working their way through skin. Alone these things were horrors and miracles wound together in one garland. They were a warning, a harbinger. You cannot be sure, she said, reflexive, unwilling to believe it, but she already knew it was true. The dread had flooded through her body and settled coldly within her. I am sure, he said. If you seek Prince Aditya, he will assure you of the same. His nameless God has spoken to him as I have been spoken to. I do not doubt it. The Yaksa are coming, and they will attempt to seize all of Parijatvipa as their own once more. Had Aditya truly known this was coming? Why hadn't he told her, warned her? Had he tried all those times he had spoken of his faith and its power, and had she simply failed to heed him? She could not consider it further now, couldn't allow the memory of her priest brother to distract her from the priest who stood before her. You would have me lead that war, she said, even as her heart turned, even as she knew. I would have you win that war, he said. For Parijatipa, for your people, I would have you win it with all the merciful strength of your great ancestor. You want me to agree to burn, she said. It did not shock her as much as it should have. Even as she felt numb horror work its way through her, even as her body went colder still and the memory of smoke filled her throat, she had known, in her heart of hearts, that fire would come for her again. You want me to rise to the pyre, she said. With willingness and with joy, he agreed, leaned forward, a softness in his mane that soothed her when it should not have. You have the look of Divyanshi, you know, he said. I have been told so, many times. The high priest seeks to make a world that is stronger and better, more true to the hopes and dreams of the mothers who burned for us. In Chandra, we saw the means to create that world, but he saw it in you, too, when you were a girl. You were good, Kartik said with absolute certainty, an intimacy in his voice that he had no right to. Good and dutiful. The high priest and all the venerable priests of the imperial temple impressed upon Chandra the importance of maintaining your purity of spirit, and Chandra sought to do so. He sought to make you into what you must be, a worthy symbol of Parijatipa's glory. Divyanshi's scion, your brother, wished for you to burn to make your purity everlasting, and Parijatipa's along with it. When you refused, it hurt him sorely. It was my right, Malini said, instead of replying with the truth in its entirety, that there had been nothing pure about the fury that had led him to see her heart-sisters burned, that framing a violent hatred in the flesh of faith did not make it any less brutal or monstrous, that her hurt had been far greater and of far more worth than whatever paltry excuse for a heart lived inside him. If Chandra had been true faithful to of the mothers, he would have accepted my choice. He did not. Kartik inclined his head in acknowledgement. He did not, he agreed. Emperor Chandra is a man of focus. His vision is like an arrow. Now he has begun to understand that the war for a better Parijatipa will not be fought against princes and kings, or a sister in revolt. He understands this is the return of an ancient struggle, but years of belief that he will face a mortal war have led him astray, and his mind will not be easily moved. You must burn, Kartik went on. Your willing death will be an incomparable weapon against the Yaksa. But your brother believes that if you will refuse him and defy him, then there are other sacrifices that will do well enough in your place. The women he had murdered in their droves to make his weapons, the fire that burned Malini's men in turn when it flew on strange wings from the maze's fort's walls, the fire on her saber gifted to her by Kartik's people, flickering and fading away. He would kill you or allow you to perish, now that he has made his false fire, but his false fire will not save us, just as your death unwilling and stolen from you will not save us. You understand then, Malini said in a voice that was far calmer than she felt, that I will never be willing, so long as Chandra lives and holds the throne. No priest has ever desired your unwilling death, he said, with tenderness that galled. We have always respected your worth, always sought your glad sacrifice. If this is the gift you demand for your willing service, then tell me so. That is all I ask. If the high priest and the inner circle who serve Chandra do not support me wholeheartedly, then I will not burn, Malini said into the silence that fell as his words faded, feeling her own horror only distantly. Her determination to win was stronger. But you would be willing, he said, if we served you, lovingly and loyally. Divyanshi's scion, tell me, if you wear the crown and sit upon the throne, will you die for it? It is the will of the mothers that brought me to war against Chandra, Malini said. It is the priests of the mothers that brought me here, for Parijatvipa and for faith. I will take the throne, and I will burn to save us. That is my vow. He smiled at her and nodded. Then I will send a message to my allies in Harshingar, he said, and when you reach the city, when you are at the doors of the Mahal, my allies will find you. How will you send a message swiftly enough? Malini demanded. I will outpace you to Harshingar, he said, amused. You have an army to move. I am one man, and the lanterns in the temple spires will light my message for me if I do not. What assurance? Malini paused, shook her head. Faith, she said. You will tell me my only assurance is faith. Just so, Divyanshi's scion, he said. There will still be a battle ahead of you, your men will still die, but when you are captured, and you shall be, the tide will turn in your favor, and I will tell you how. He told her what was to come, and when he was done, she thought of the battle that awaited her, thought of men dead and bloodied soil, and roused tired eyes, thought of Aditya and Saketa fighting to keep the enemy at her back at bay. She knew what Chandra had wasted swaths of men at the battle on the Very, but he still had his fire, and false though it was, it would still devastate her army before it died. It would still cost her the bulk of her forces. those allies she had brought along with her using nothing but the fraying promise of the myth that surrounded her as the guilt and glory. She was still so terribly likely to lose. She would have to trust this man, this priest who spoke to her as if he knew her, called her good, dutiful, pure. She would, if all else failed, have to place her life in his hands. Her skin crawled even as she held the certainty inside herself, cold and sure. She would make her own plans, of course. She would assure Chandra's death if she had the power to do it. If the priest betrayed her, then she would make sure she would not die helpless, all her work undone. By the mother's and by her own vicious nature, some of her ambitions would outlive her. She would need Priya's help for that. She thought of Priya. Priya, who was a temple elder. Priya, who worshipped the Yaksa and loved her people and her flowering gods. She felt a terrible realization slide its way beneath her ribs. She could not tell Priya the truth. She would ask Priya to fight for her, maybe die for her, on the basis of lies. To enter battle for the sake not just of the bonds between their nations, but for love. For the trust she'd placed in Malini long ago, when she'd allowed Malini to hold a knife to her heart. When she'd kissed Malini in a forest and told Malini she did not have the power to hurt her. But I do, Malini thought. Her heart hurt. She wanted to be sick. Malini had always known in her soul what her mission would make of her. She touched her fingertips to the flower beneath her blouse, a helpless gesture. She loved Priya. The feeling was dark and deep within her, with its own steady undercurrent, always reaching for her, always dragging her under. But she needed to win this war. Needed it more than tenderness or love. Needed it with a fire that burned and screamed in her heart-sister's name. She needed it because her brother's blade had found her and cut the goodness from her long before she'd ever learned the shape of a gentle, encompassing love. If she had to risk Priya for her vengeance, if she had to place her in danger in order to win, and see her brother dead, so be it.